Welcome back. We're getting into Trump, ICE, and who gets to call America home. Then we slide into women, family, and why some guys just want silence. Okay, the Trump thing first, because that was wild to hear. The idea that he basically had to win or face prison is a huge claim. It is, and he's framing it like pure survival, not just politics, which is a very elegant way to say the entire country is one long hostage note. Exactly. And then he says winning required deals, because of course it did. But the part that stood out was the ICE stuff, because that got heated fast. He was basically saying the agents are inexperienced and undertrained, not necessarily evil. That's a generous read when people are getting zip-tied on camera. Right. And the mask thing makes it feel way more sinister than it maybe is. But his argument is that bad training creates ugly behavior, not just bad intent. Which is such a cop-out if you're the person being slammed against a wall. Totally. Because even if the institution is amateurish, the person still gets hurt. And then he pivots to kids in raids like it's no big deal. That was the moment where I was like, come on, you can't just shrug that off. If you're law enforcement, your standard has to be way higher than this. But he's also trying to say the environments they go into are genuinely chaotic. Like that apartment example with squatters and deadbolts and all that mess. Sure, but bad conditions don't magically justify every rough thing that happens. The hallway was gross is not exactly a moral defense. No, but that's basically how he frames the whole thing. Then he goes hard on the fiscal argument, which is where he feels strongest. He's saying undocumented immigrants use services, send money out, and cost taxpayers. But he says it like the numbers are settled law and nobody can challenge it. He does keep insisting it's backed by the numbers, though. Which is always funny when somebody says the numbers like they're holding the universe hostage. The bigger move is that he doesn't even stop at money. He's saying borders are about permission, culture, and who gets to define the country. That was the part where he got really territorial about American identity. Yeah, like you can't just walk in and become American by existing there. But then he starts sorting people by heritage, language, and real belonging. And that's where the conversation becomes less policy and more civilization theory. Which is exactly why it blows up online every time. Because people are not hearing nuance, they're hearing a grenade. And then somehow the interview swerves into women, which was honestly the funniest part. Oh man, that entire stretch was just one giant cold shower. He basically says dating is non-existent and marriage does not really appeal to him. Never even being in a serious relationship is a crazy reveal. He said it so casually, too, like he was talking about not liking broccoli. And the weird thing is, he's not even pretending to be a romantic traditionalist. He's just saying work and ideas are what actually animate him. Which is valid personally, but then he starts universalizing it. That's the tension, because he talks like his preferences are a model. And then he says the man should have authority in the relationship, which is where a lot of people are going to slam the brakes. Because if your relationship runs like a boardroom, somebody's already exhausted. Right, and he means responsibility, not just domination, but still. He's grounding it in physical protection, crisis management, and final say. But that assumes every household needs one person permanently driving. The pushback from the host was basically, what about teamwork? Exactly, and that's where the whole thing gets more interesting than the slogans. Because he's also not denying that women are essential at all. He actually got weirdly poetic about mothers for a second. Yeah, he says women create life and mother-child bonds are basically unmatched. And that's the part that makes it hard to flatten him into one cartoon. Still, his helpmate language is going to set people on fire. Helpmate is such a phrase, man. That word sounds like it came with a mustache and a permission slip. Exactly, and yet he says it like everyone should just nod along. The more interesting part is his loneliness around all that. He likes silence, he likes work, and he sounds genuinely built for isolation. That part felt almost sad, honestly. Yeah, because he's not selling it as freedom so much as a personality limitation. Then you get to the kids question, and he basically admits the risk makes family harder. Once you have a wife and child, every political move gets heavier. Which is a fair point, because courage looks different when someone else pays the price. And that's probably why he sounds so conflicted about it. He wants the legacy, but not the vulnerability that comes with it. That's a very human contradiction, honestly. Then there's the part about his parents getting targeted, which is grim. Doxing his dad and posting his parents online is beyond politics. That's just punishing by association, and it's ugly. He clearly feels guilty that his life spills onto people around him. And then the MAGA split comes in, which is the real pressure point. He's saying Trump won, but then the movement feels betrayed by what came after. Iran, Epstein, immigration pace, corporate stuff, all of it becomes ammo. So for him, the question is whether America First is still real or just branding, which is the kind of question that turns a movement into a family fight. And that's why the interview felt bigger than one guy being provocative. It was really about how far a movement can stretch before it splits, and whether the loudest voices are driving it or just surfacing its ugliest edges. All right, that's where we'll land it for today. Next episode, we get into the part where the movement starts eating itself. Episode 3 is where the real knives come out. Welcome back. This episode gets into Trump, ICE, and why the whole MAGA coalition is wobbling. It also gets weirdly personal, because the interview keeps sliding into power, identity, and who belongs. And honestly, once people start talking like that, it stops being politics and becomes a therapy session. Wait, did you notice how quickly it went from Trump to prison math? Yeah, like the vibe was basically win or disappear into a legal volcano. That part is actually insane, though, because it frames every compromise as survival. Sure, but that's also how people excuse almost anything if they win. That is true, the winner always gets the cleanest biography. What got me was the way he described ICE like a bunch of amateurs. I know he basically said the whole thing feels like hired chaos. And to be fair, if you're sending undertrained people into hostile situations, mess is inevitable. But that argument gets dangerous fast because it can turn abuse into incompetence theater. Exactly, and once a system starts dressing up violence as sloppiness, everybody pretends not to see it. The kid part really bothered me, though, the whole zip ties and masks thing. Same, because that image is doing a lot of political damage all by itself. But the counterpoint was always going to be, what do you do in a raid when people are scattered? Right, and that's where policy gets ugly, because edge cases become the whole argument. The conversation basically became, who deserves a federal budget and who doesn't? And then he kept landing on this fiscal argument, which is where it gets so cold. Yeah, the tone was like, you may be hardworking, but are you a profitable citizen? That's the brutal thing about these debates. They turn human lives into line items. And yet that's how a lot of voters are actually thinking now. The thing I kept circling back to was his definition of American. Yeah, because he made it sound like culture, language, heritage, and paperwork all have to match. Which is convenient if you want to make citizenship feel like an interview nobody passes. Exactly, and then it becomes less about law and more about a vibe check. But here's where it got especially loaded, when he started talking about who built the country. Yeah, that was the moment he shifted from nationalism into historical sorting. And whenever people start ranking who counts as foundational, somebody gets erased. That's the problem, because the more confident the claim sounds, the more brittle it gets. Then he jumped straight into women, and man, that part was almost a separate universe. It was like the interview suddenly hit a different operating system. He really said dating is basically unnecessary if you have work and silence. That is the most anti-romantic thing I have heard from a man with internet presence. The crazy part is he sounded completely sincere, which makes it even stranger. Do you think he actually believes that? Or is he just overcorrecting for his audience? I think he believes it, but I also think he knows it plays well with certain guys. And that's where it gets messy, because sincerity and branding start looking identical. He even made marriage sound like a logistical inconvenience. Bro was talking about a wife like she was optional middleware. But he did say women are essential for motherhood and family, which matters to him. Sure, but he framed it in this very rigid way where usefulness kept coming first. And that's the contradiction, because he praises women and still sounds emotionally detached from them. Yeah, it felt like admiration from a distance, not partnership. The part about him being obsessed with work actually made more sense to me. Same, because some people really are built like that, where the mission replaces everything else. And he admitted he's not normal, which is probably the most normal thing he said. Honestly, that was his most relatable line by accident. But then, he started talking about young men being told to soften up, and I can see the appeal there. Yeah, because a lot of men do feel like they're getting mixed signals from school, culture, and dating. Still, the leap from that frustration to patriarchy is where I start tapping the brakes. Right, because every complaint about loneliness does not need to become a manifesto. He kept using Andrew Tate like a proof point, which tells you exactly where the conversation wanted to go. Do you think people are responding to the message or just the swagger? Probably both, because swagger is easy to mistake for clarity. And when young men feel ignored, they'll follow whoever speaks to the wound first. That's the part nobody wants to admit, because it makes the audience part of the story. Then he started talking about his family getting targeted, and the whole thing got real fast. Yeah, because once it leaves theory and hits your parents, it changes the emotional math. Exactly. And you can disagree with him while still seeing how ugly that pressure is. Do you think that makes him more careful or more reckless? Weirdly, it can do both, because fear makes some people mellow and others sharpen their edges. In his case, I think it sharpened the edges and gave them a microphone. And then there's the civil war inside MAGA, which is probably the biggest story here. Totally, because once the movement gets big enough, the enemies stop being external. It turns into cousins yelling at each other in the same living room. That is exactly what it feels like, except the living room has a presidential seal. The frustration is that they expected America first and got a bunch of old patterns back. Yeah, war talk, donor math, immigration ambiguity, all the stuff they said they were fighting. And that's why the coalition is cracking, because disappointment is more dangerous than opposition. Opposition at least keeps people honest for a while. What I find wild is how the interview keeps revealing the same pattern over and over. Which is power on one side, grievance on the other, and everyone calling it principle. That is the whole show, honestly. All right, that's where we'll leave it for today. In the next episode, the split gets sharper and the arguments get even uglier. Episode 3 is where the movement stops pretending it's one family. Welcome back, because this one gets into power, identity, and the price of winning. And honestly, this interview keeps swinging between real insight and absolute chaos. The Trump part especially is wild because it starts sounding tactical and ends sounding existential. Like, wait, are we talking politics or survival now? He kind of makes it sound like those are the same thing. That line about win or jail is doing a lot of work. It frames every compromise like self-defense. That is a very convenient way to describe deal-making. Convenient is doing Olympic-level lifting there. But I do get the logic he's pushing, which is that Trump stopped being just a politician. He became a guy trying to survive the machinery he kicked. And once you buy that story, every move after that looks justified. That's where I start rolling my eyes a little. Because if every institution is the enemy, then accountability disappears. Exactly, and then every aggressive move becomes framed as necessary. It's basically political cardio at that point. Just constant sprinting in place. But the ICE part was interesting because he almost argued incompetence instead of cruelty. Which is a pretty slick pivot, if we're being honest. Yeah, because saying they're untrained is softer than saying they're abusive. And yet the outcome still looks ugly on camera. The optics do not care about the internal memo. That is such a brutal sentence, but yes. If you're wearing a mask, zip-tying people, and scaring kids, people will react. Even if the original job was supposedly law enforcement. Especially if the public can't tell who's professional and who's panicking. He kept trying to separate the bad raids from the broader policy case. And that's where the immigration argument gets slippery. Because one minute it's about dangerous criminals and the next it's about plumbers. The plumber is always the emotional test case now. Every political argument eventually becomes a guy with a work van. But he really leans hard into the fiscal angle. He's basically saying the country is subsidizing people who entered illegally, and then treating that as the whole moral story. Right, as if taxes and identity were the same argument. That's what made the citizenship stuff even sharper. He is not just saying borders matter, he's saying membership matters. And then he starts defining American identity in this very narrow, old-school way. English, heritage, culture, the whole checklist. Basically a country as a club with very annoying gatekeeping. Honestly, yes, that is the vibe. And then he gets into the Native American point, which is where the whole thing starts sparking. Because he's trying to separate occupation from founding. But it still lands like he's sanding down a brutal history. Exactly, and that's why this interview keeps feeling dangerous. He's not just describing a nation, he's ranking who belongs inside it. That kind of hierarchy always gets people heated for a reason. Then he pivots straight into women, and the whole room changes temperature. That was such a hard turn, man. Because he's suddenly talking about being non-existent in dating and not wanting marriage. Which is fascinating because he's talking like someone who has completely opted out. Not casually either, like philosophically opted out. And then he says women are ideal for help, but not the center of his life. That sentence alone could start 1,000 comment sections. It probably already has. The weird part is he keeps insisting he's not prescribing it to everyone. But then he spends the rest of the time describing how men should be more dominant. So the disclaimer and the pitch are kind of fighting each other. That's actually a great way to put it. He's arguing that masculinity got socially punished and the pendulum needs to swing back. And that part is why people latch onto him so fast. Because there is a real hunger for men to feel useful again. But he takes that hunger and drives it into patriarchy, which is not exactly a subtle destination. Not even a little. The stuff about boys being over-policed is where I actually saw his point a little. Like helicopter parenting, school culture, all of it can flatten boys. And then social media just makes every weird instinct feel criminal. There's a real issues there, even if his fix is extreme. That's the pattern in the whole conversation, honestly. A legitimate grievance gets wrapped in a maximalist worldview. Then the worldview shows up wearing steel-toed boots. That is disgusting but accurate. The women and family section got more interesting once he talked about children. He said he likes the idea but not the noise, basically. He really sounded like a man who enjoys a locked door and silence. A man and his silence, man, that was a whole personality reveal. He even said he might be too particular for the classic family life. Which is rare honesty, I'll give him that. Though he then turns around and talks like his model should guide other men. That contradiction is doing a lot of heavy lifting, too. And then there's the fan messaging, which is its own whole thing. The wife application line was insane. That sounds like a nightmare in Google form format. A disaster with a profile picture. But he's right that fame changes the incentives completely. You stop wondering if someone likes you and start wondering what they want. That has to be exhausting. Then he gets into the very real cost of having a family when you live like a target. That part landed harder than the ideological stuff, honestly. Because once your parents are being doxxed, it stops being an abstract internet problem. It becomes guilt, like he said. And that's the part most people online ignore when they cheer this stuff on. They want the drama without the human cost. Free speech until someone finds your dad. That is dark, but yeah. The last stretch about the MAGA split is probably the real spine of the episode. Because that's where the interview stops being personal and becomes strategic. He's basically saying the movement is mad because Trump promised one thing and delivered another. Especially on foreign policy and the war posture. And on deportations and on the whole America First brand. Right. And when he says the base feels betrayed, that's not nothing. It explains why factions start circling each other so aggressively. Because once the promise cracks, people start counting receipts. And nobody counts receipts like an internet movement. They invoice each other emotionally for sport. What I keep coming back to is how much of this is about belonging. Belonging to a nation, a movement, a family, even a gender role. He's obsessed with borders because he's obsessed with boundaries everywhere else, too. That's actually a sharp observation. He wants clean lines in a world that is basically all blur. And the internet is one giant blur machine. It really is. That's why this episode feels bigger than the interview itself. It's not just about what he believes, it's about what kind of people those beliefs create. And whether they can ever coexist with the rest of the country. All right, that's where we'll leave it for today. Episode 3 is where the split gets sharper and the arguments get uglier. And trust me, it does not calm down from here.